A year ago, we knew Colin Allred as a candidate for U.S. Congress for District 32. As his biography noted at the time, he's the son of a single mother, he's a past student body president at Hillcrest High School, he's a former NFL linebacker, and he's a civil rights attorney. Now we also know him as Colin Allred, U.S. Representative from Texas 32. He's the first Democrat to hold this position since 2003 when District 32 was first created. Since taking office this past January, Colin Allred has distinguished himself as a team player who believes that a bipartisan approach is the best way to achieve results. In his 6-month report, released in July of this year, he noted that 70% of the bills he co-sponsored were bipartisan. He has held at least one bipartisan town hall, and he has deliberately chosen to work on committees where the issues they address tend to be bipartisan. He's on transportation and infrastructure, he's on foreign affairs, and he's on veterans affairs. In the first 9 months on the job, Colin has shown us what he can expect to see in the future. In July, with Texas Republican Ron Wright, Colin has supported converting a closed Baylor Scott and Wright Hospital in Garland into a VA facility. In September, he joined with a Democratic congressman from Washington State and a Republican from Pennsylvania to co-sponsor a bill that makes needed reforms to the Federal Election Commission. As a candidate for a re-election in 2020, this is what he's promised us. I came here to be a workhorse, not a show horse. He's made an impressive start, and we can expect him to continue to work for our interests this year and next year and in years to come. And now here to share some of his ideas with you, Colin Allred.
Well, it's a shame that we're meeting when there's nothing to talk about. I don't know. I mean, you know, there's a lot going on. I'm happy to be back home. Hey Mayor, how are you doing? Mayor Belker's here. It's been an interesting first 8 or 9 months in office, and I hope that a few years. It feels a lot longer. My wife and I had a baby a month in.
Yes.
Our son is now 7.5 months old. He's sitting up. He's crawling. He's biting everything in sight. And he has a lot more patience than some of my colleagues in Congress. Better behaved also, right? Well, my commitment to y'all when I was running was to try and get things done, that I wasn't just going to be, a hardcore partisan. I'm a proud Democrat, but I wanted to make sure that we could bridge the divides in our country. I was worried about the increasing divide there, and wanted to try to bring us together around our fundamental values that I thought we shared, and spend more time, if we could, focusing on those than the things that we didn't share. And as you know, I was hesitant and reluctant and didn't want to pursue some of the things that I thought would be very divisive for the country and would put the country through a hard time. But some of the recent events, of course, have, I think, forced my hand. And I felt like the oath of office that I took was to the Constitution and to protect and defend that Constitution. And that there were violations of that Constitution being committed that I thought warranted this step that we've taken. And so I know that there are folks in North Texas who disagree with me about that pretty vehemently. I know there are folks who were mad at me for not previously moving on impeachment. And I know that there are folks who are just worried about how this is going to turn out. But my commitment to you is that I'm not pursuing this as a partisan. I'm not pursuing this as somebody who is enjoying this. It's not what I wanted. I have priorities, as Pam was mentioning, that have nothing to do with impeachment or even with kind of the partisan rancor that you see every day. The VA hospital we're trying to get built in Garland, or transitioned in Garland, I led a letter and an effort that brought together the entire North Texas delegation, Republicans and Democrats, to serve 180,000 additional veterans. That's not a partisan issue. We all know we should be serving our veterans better. We all know that they should get the care they need. And the fact that any veteran is waiting 40 to 80 days to get a bed North Texas is too long. That made sense to pursue. There are other things that we've worked on in a bipartisan fashion that we're trying to get done to make sure that you don't sit in traffic for as long as you are, or that we are able to clean up our elections as much as possible, as you mentioned with the FEC regulations that we're trying to change, or the implementation, I should say, that we're trying to change, that really aren't partisan issues, and just trying to find these common sense, common ground issues. And that's still my commitment to you. Regardless of what happens here, regardless of where this goes, my commitment is the same. And I know many of you are partisan Democrats. That's great. Some of you might not be. That's fine. But that's my commitment to this area, that I was going to try and represent who I thought we were. I was going to try and stand up for our values and represent those values as best as I could. And we have things that we need to get done here that existed before this presidency, before this moment in our politics, and things that are going to exist afterwards that we're going to have to deal with. And we all know that we have the highest uninsured rate in the country here in Texas. And Dallas County has 1 in 5 people, 20% of our people don't have health insurance. And we have to do something about that. I want to lower the cost of health care for those of you who have insurance but can't afford it. Last week, you wouldn't have known it because, of course, everything else that happened, but we introduced a really massive prescription drug reform bill that would change the way prescription drugs are sold in this country. During the campaign, we talked a lot about allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drugs. And this bill would not only do that, but would give the Secretary of Health and Human Services the carrot and the stick to make sure that any pharmaceutical company that's trying to gouge the American people is not able to. It would lower the cost of drugs for people who are on Medicare, lower the cost of drugs for folks who aren't. Things like insulin and EpiPens and other required drugs people need to live would become affordable. It's good for the American people. It's actually bipartisan. A lot of it is the president has said he wants to do it, and folks in the Senate have said they want to do it. That's the kind of stuff that I think and I wanted to be focused on doing. Because when I was growing up here in North Texas, we needed certain things to be in place for me to be able to succeed. We needed to go to a good school, have access to community organizations like the YMCA, where I spent a lot of my time and had a lot of people who helped me out. Have people in my life who gave me a helping hand, and we needed to have things that were affordable and access to things that would allow us to chase our version of the American dream. And that's what I want for North Texas. I know that regardless of the current atmosphere in the country, the American dream is getting harder to pursue. Social mobility is decreasing. And to me, that's the biggest issue facing us, is our inequality. The fact that our gaps between the haves and have-nots are growing by so much. And that's dangerous for our democracy, and it's not who we are here in this country. And we are making some progress in North Texas. We're doing some good things. But I always, and have thought for a while, that Washington has been in the way of much of that, unfortunately. And what we're seeing already play out, with people just immediately retreating to their corners on the issue of the day, is just confirming one of the reasons why I wanted to run. It's because there have to be certain facts that are shared, right, that we all agree on. There have to be certain things that aren't fungible, that aren't shades of gray, that can't just be, well, if I did it, so did they. No. We're a country of laws, and we have to be able to establish certain facts, work from those, and see what we can get done. So, in my first months before all of this happened, we tried to address things like gun violence, to make sure that if you were going to purchase a firearm, that you went through a background check. Something that's supported by 90% of the American people. Supported by the vast majority of NRA members even. Bipartisan support for that. We passed that, the Senate did nothing with it. We passed the Violence Against Women Act that closed the boyfriend loophole, which said basically if you've been convicted of stalking or harassing your partner, that you wouldn't be able to get access to a firearm, because we know that over 50 women a month are being shot by intimate partners. We passed that. The Senate has done nothing with that. We knew that money in politics was becoming a huge problem. It was making it more difficult for your voice to be heard in our democracy. So we passed H.R. 1, which is our first bill, that's why it's number 1, to implement a system of public financing, have automatic voter registration, huge, like the most sweeping anti-corruption, pro-democracy bill the House has passed in decades. And we're going to be breaking it up into pieces to try and pass those pieces, but the Senate hasn't taken it up. We past, bipartisan bills that have come through the House haven't been taken up. So to the extent that you feel like nothing's getting done in Washington, I hope that we can place the onus where it deserves to be placed, which is on the Senate. So my priorities haven't changed, regardless of kind of the importance of this moment. But I do think that history is watching us, and my commitment to you is that everything I do throughout this process will be done as soberly, as deliberatively, as with the interest of our Constitution and the country in mind as possible, and not as just pursuing some partisan end or personal goal. And should it hurt my chances of re-election, that's okay, because I didn't take an oath of re-election, I took an oath of office. Too many people who feel like this job is like what they exist for. That's not how I feel, right? I want to continue representing you. I've enjoyed doing it. I think that we're just getting started. But there are certain things that are more important than the kind of short-term partisan interests of any individual member of Congress. We have to pursue what's in the interest of the country. And that's my commitment to you on all of these issues, but particularly on the biggest issue of the day, which of course has been impeachment. So I can talk and talk and talk, but what's more interesting to me, of course, is kind of what's on your mind. And I know we have cards, but if we get to the cards and people want to ask a question, we can extend that to you.
The cards. Can you guys hear me? Should I try the mic? Or should I without the mic? Try the mic? Yes, please.
Hold up, I've got to turn it all back on.
Okay, never mind. I will just ask the question. Pardon?
It makes weird noise.
It makes weird noise? Okay. So the first question that we have is from Billy in Richardson, and I'm going to hopefully read what she has here, is specific details about what Congress and the American people can do to ensure the election in 2020 is not invalidated by hacking or other means.
Yeah. Well, this is the big question. I mean, what is a democracy except for elections? If you have a democracy that's functioning under the cloud of an election that wasn't legitimate, then that government isn't legitimate, in my opinion. And so this is the whole ball game, right? And we know that there are entities around the world, certainly the Russians being foremost among them, that would love to influence our elections from the local level, certainly to the presidential level. And one of the things that, of course, was most troubling to me about the recent events was the idea that the next election might not be legitimate because the president might be using the weight and power of our foreign policy to try and influence and bring foreign influence into our election. And also the message that sends to the rest of the world that we're open for business if you're willing to help me personally and politically for intervention. I mean, I've read articles, I'm sure you have as well, about that they're not even having meetings about the integrity of our elections. And they're not having like high-level meetings because they're afraid that that will trigger something in the White House and people will be upset because they'll see it as an attack on the president for the last election. Well, this has nothing to do with that. There's nothing to do with that. This is not about trying to relitigate 2016. It's about trying to make sure that 2020 is a fair reflection of your votes and of our votes and our voices. And, you know, I was a voting rights lawyer before I did this, and I think everyone who's eligible should be able to cast a ballot with as little interference from their state or from any foreign entity as possible, and that we should make it easy. The good news is there are entities that are hard at work at this. I visited the NSA, and they showed me what they did, and I can't go into all of it, but in 2018 to prevent the Russian plan that they had to try and do some of the same things they did in 2016 and 2018, and they were successful. They shut down, this is public knowledge, they shut down the Internet Research, I think, agency is what it's called, which is basically a Russian front. And they were able to do that, and they did some other things too. And so they're professionals who are on the job, and we've passed election security measures in the House to add additional funding for states and municipalities to help run their elections in a safe and secure way, and the Senate hasn't taken them up. And so I would encourage all of you to write and contact our senators to say, this is not a partisan issue. You know, whether or not I support you or not is immaterial to whether or not you should care about the next election being safe and secure. You know, bring up the election security bills that are in front of you and pass them, and let's make sure this next election is a fair and free election. That's what we have to do. Like, we have to put the pressure on about this. But the other thing I'll add is that there is a component for all of us. There's a component for all of you. And I went to Ohio and visited my colleague Anthony Gonzalez, who's a Republican in Ohio. He played in the NFL as well. We're good friends. I visited his district and we did a town hall there, and I told them the same thing I'll tell you, which is that it's incumbent on us to make sure that we combat actual fake news ourselves, that we don't share things on social media that aren't fully vetted and that aren't from established journalists and things like that, or that if you see others doing it, that you call it out. And I'm not telling you to get into Twitter wars and things like that, but I'm saying we have to be responsible citizens. You know, our democracy is not a spectator sport. We're all involved in it. It's all constantly going on, and we all have input into it. And so we have to make sure that when we're talking about it, and when we're engaging in it with our friends in our own circles, that we're doing it on a fact-based basis. And so we're going to have our own role in standing up to this. And I am worried still about some of the abilities to hack and change voter rolls and even change vote totals. In Texas, we don't have exactly the same problem. The Dallas County Elections Department, who I've worked with and talked with, I know they have a plan in place. We are also kind of protected because we have 254 counties that all run their own elections. And so they're all very segmented, and it's very difficult to just have one single point of influence. But in the Mueller report, if you read part 1, which is the part about the Russian interference, he notes in there that there are several counties, I think, in Florida that were hacked. And they didn't say what they were, but you can kind of guess which ones they were because they were strategic ones. And that's very frightening because we know that in any presidential election, it could come down to just 8, 9, 10 municipalities, right? And so we have to be vigilant against it. You have my commitment to keep working on it. We need a little bit of help from everybody else in the government to make sure they have the same commitment. So that's my answer.
This question is from somebody that's asking about expanding the hate crimes to include transgender community with the news
Yes.
of violence against transgender women, especially right now.
Yeah, we lost Malaysia, Booker, and others, and we have had a rash of these attacks on transgender women in North Texas, and we have to, I think, ourselves examine what in our community here has allowed this to happen, what are we not doing enough of in terms of policing, and also spreading tolerance to combat it, and what can we do. And so I was a co-sponsor of and voted for the Equality Act, and the Equality Act extended all of these civil rights protections in the Civil Rights Act to LGBTQ folks, right? And so that would extend also hate crime legislation and things like that. So that bill, of course, passed the House. I think it even had some Republican support in the House, and is not being taken up by the Senate. And there's no reason, in my opinion, for the Senate not to take this up. It's not like a Democratic priority to prevent, I think, attacks on LGBTQ folks. It should be an American priority to make sure that you can't be fired because of who you love or who you marry. Right now, in Texas, because we don't have a state statute or a federal statute protecting it, you can get married on Saturday, and if your employer finds out about it, be fired on Monday. You can. That's unacceptable in our country. Now, Dallas, the city, has some ordinances around it, and I'm sure some other municipalities do, but they need to have the overarching support of federal legislation, which is why we passed the Equality Act. I encourage you, just go look into it. It's not like a big partisan thing. I think it should be taken up by the Senate. I think that this president, who said that he was going to be, when he was running, friendly to LGBTQ folks, should pass it or should sign it. And it shouldn't. We should just move on from debating whether or not we're going to protect our LGBTQ citizens and just do it.
We've seen with the recent climate marches that this is an issue that energizes young people in particular. And this question is about the Green New Deal and if there are concerns you have with that because you haven't signed on as a co-sponsor.
Yeah. Well, the Green New Deal is not legislation. Okay, everybody knows that, right? It's a resolution stating positions on various things. And as was mentioned earlier, I am very careful about what I co-sponsor. Over 70% of the bills that I co-sponsor are bipartisan. If I put my name behind it, you should know that it's a real priority for me, that I want it to pass, that I want it to become law, all of that. Now, when I talk to young people, there's two things that come up more than anything: gun violence prevention and climate. And I thank them for their activism, for their interest in this. My son is 7 months old. He's going to inherit and be here a lot longer than I am, certainly. And what kind of planet is he going to inherit? What kind of a climate is he going to have to live in? That's something that I think about a lot. And one of the first bills that we passed was to recommit the United States to the Paris Climate Accord. That is a common sense thing, in my opinion. We're the only major country in the world that's not a member of the Paris Climate Accord. Now, the actual pulling out of it doesn't occur until, I think, April 2021. So should we have a different result in the 2020 election, maybe we can be recommitted to the Paris Climate Accord. But it's a pretty amazing thing that we, the United States, got the Chinese and the Russians and all the Indians, all the major emitters and polluters in the world to commit to standards that we're going to apply to ourselves. It was a huge diplomatic victory for the United States to get that commitment, and that then we're the ones who pulled out of it. It's embarrassing. But we also have to do, of course, more in terms of developing the next generation of green energy. And many of you have heard me say this before, but it's true. In many ways, Texas is leading the way. We really are. We're the #1 state in the country for wind energy. We have by far the most wind energy produced in the state, or in the country. About 17% of our electricity comes from wind, which is a higher percentage than anywhere else except for, I think, Iowa. So we're doing well on that. I've visited some of our solar entrepreneurs and have seen their plans for what they think we can do in solar. I mean, the sun is still definitely shining today, even though we're in October and it feels summer-like. So we have unlimited capacity for solar. Those smart investments are actually also being made by some of our energy companies here, because they see themselves as able to make money in this. And I think that's the right thing. We want to remain an energy state because that's what we are, but we should lead the next generation of energy. And so we have, and I've supported measures to increase funding and sent letters to the Department of Energy and to the Department of Defense, to their folks who are developing some of the kind of experimental next generation stuff of green energy, to support them and provide the funding that they need for that. Because if we bring down the cost of our renewables so that they are so competitive that they begin to replace some of our fossil fuel, then that's when the real turnover will happen, and it'll happen rapidly. For us, it's all going to be about cost. We can't ask people, and I don't think we will ask people, to just pay 2-3 times more for a different type of power. When I was growing up on a fixed income, my mom's making less than $45,000 a year as a teacher, you couldn't just say to us, okay, pay $100 more for energy this month because it'll be better for the planet. Okay, sorry, but we can't afford that, right? So for everyday folks, we have to make it so that that choice isn't a difficult one, and that we make those renewable energy sources available. There's also some great news coming out of the auto industry. Toyota's headquartered here in Plano. I met with them. I drove a fuel cell car of theirs, hydrogen fuel cell. The only thing it emits is water. H2O. That's the only thing that it emits. And in California, they have some of the infrastructure in place so that you can stop and refuel that car. But we don't have that in Texas, so they're not selling that car here, though it is being sold in California. And so part of what we're also looking at on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is that this next generation of infrastructure has to be a green infrastructure that also has fueling points for alternative fuel cars and electric cell vehicles and hydrogen cell vehicles, so that when you stop at the gas station, you have the option to do that. It's not enough to just say drive one of these cars, but then you're not going to be able to get filled up. We want to change that as well. And our transportation industry and our transportation in general is a huge emitter of our pollutants in the air. And so that's why I'm always trying to find creative ways to get around and to reduce our emissions. So I've been supportive of the high-speed train between Dallas and Houston, and there are a lot of reasons for that. It's a great thing. The 5th largest metropolitan area in the country in Dallas, DFW, the 4th largest in Houston, connecting them by a 90-minute high-speed train. You can obviously identify the economic impacts that would have for us and how good that would be to connect those two in another way. But it's also true that 90% of the trips between Dallas and Houston are done by car. So to take cars off the road, we need to diversify the options that people have. The light rail, we got $60 million of a grant for DART to expand the platforms on the light rail, which will be in Richardson. And that's going to be big. So it'll be to add another car to the light rail and take more people on that. Going north-south is already hard enough with the tollway and 75 being full. So we have to diversify our options. And the final thing I'll say is we're looking at what the future of transportation is going to be. And it's going to have to be that we are more efficient with what we have. So self-driving cars sounds like science fiction and everything, but it's going to be very important for us because we are so inefficient right now with our roadways and with our space. Anytime you have an accident or you have a car breaking down and it's clogging up the lanes, you know what congestion also does when cars aren't moving? It produces more pollution in those areas. Moving roads are better for our air. So we have to be more efficient with those roadways and make them safer and moving faster and more easily. And so your cars will have to talk to each other and be in communication. Whether or not they'll be self-driving or not is probably something that will be decided over the course of how that technology evolves. But they're going to have to be in touch with each other so they can't get in accidents. And that's kind of going to be where the future of some of this stuff goes, is that we're going to have to be smarter with what we have, more efficient with what we have. And so I'm very, very aware of and I don't call it the climate change, because the climate is changing. We're currently in a climate crisis, and what can we do? And the final thing I'll say, I know I said this is the final thing, but reclamation of the carbon that's already been produced is really important. And so projects to plant more trees, create more green spaces, and some of the research that's being done on what can we do to draw down some of what we already emitted is actually very exciting, because it may be true that the scientists will save us from what we've done. It's not science fiction. There's some interesting things going on. You can look it up and see some of the research that's happening, that we might be not that far away from a breakthrough in terms of what can we do to actually reclaim some of what we've already emitted.
I tried to group the questions, and a lot of them are sort of one-off, but I have like 6 cards here that are sort of the same theme about international foreign relations in terms of genocide, in terms of atrocities that are happening in Kashmir, in Egypt, around the globe.
Yeah. Well, you know I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and one of the things that, there was an article I think today or yesterday in the Washington Post about how this president's interactions with foreign leaders, he has abandoned our previous positions on human rights and does not pressure them, does not ask them to comply with international standards, and has even encouraged some of the worst human rights abusers around the world to keep doing what they're doing. I'm thinking specifically of congratulating Duterte on being so great on the drug issue, when what he's really doing is extrajudicial killings of people in the Philippines. And then, of course, the Saudis and others, you can kind of go down the list. And what's happening in Kashmir is extremely concerning to me, because we are seeing a democracy that's not behaving as a democracy. And anti-democratic impulses are spreading across the globe. Democracies are on the run. And you're seeing a rise of parties and of leaders often identifying as nationalists in many countries around the globe that are retreating from democratic ideals and values. And that's when it's more important than ever that the President of the United States and the United States itself stand in that void and say, no, that's not the world order that we're going to preside over. That democracy is important, human rights are important, and if you don't comply with these things, then the United States and all of the power that we have is going to come crashing down on you. So when the President says to Xi in China, we're not going to say anything about Hong Kong if you work with us on trade. I mean, what does it profit a man to gain the world but to lose your soul, right? I mean, that's something that's in our books, but that's also true for countries. What does it profit us if we maybe change the trade deficit a little bit with China, but allow the people of Hong Kong and their democracy to be strangled and allow the continued spread of that anti-democratic idea that they've been leading around the world? I mean, that's not who we are. And across Democratic and Republican administrations, for generations, we have been standing up for human rights. And we've stopped doing that. And if you watch any of the Foreign Affairs Committee's hearings that I'm on C-SPAN, and you can go back and even see them. I think we posted some of them on my social media channels as well. You can see that I question Trump administration officials almost every time on why are we not standing up for human rights? Why are you not pressuring the Saudis on this? Why are you not pressuring this country on that? Because that's what's so great about us, is that they have to deal with us. Whether they're an ally or a trade partner, or they want to trade with us, or even if they're an adversary, we are the indispensable country in the world, and so they have to deal with us. So we can always say, as a condition of that, you have to do something about your human rights violations.
So what do they answer?
Well, they say that, that's a good question. They say that, we've had you can actually, I think I posted this on my official site account, that they have off-the-record discussions about human rights violations, that they're encouraging people behind closed doors, and I told them, I said, that's not acceptable. Like, it can't be like an off-the-record conversation. It has to be front and center. That's what,
Right.
that's what the pressure is about.
Yes, for
Right.
sure.
I just want to say it's really dangerous for us, and I'll also throw in what's going on with Afghanistan right now and the negotiations that they had, that they nearly brought the Taliban to Camp David on the week of 9/11, were it not for a blow-up there. I want to pull out of Afghanistan militarily as much as anybody. I don't think that there is a military solution to Afghanistan, and every general and person who's been involved militarily there will tell you the same thing, that there is not going to be a military solution to Afghanistan. But we can't pull out and leave the Afghani women behind. We can't pull out and leave the Afghani minorities and the rights that they have gained in the meantime behind. That can't happen. It can't be that they return to the 16th century just because the Taliban has a backwards view of the world, and that we're going to be okay with that. Otherwise, what did we fight for? What did all those brave men and women go over there and spend their lives and their time fighting for, if not to try and create a more stable Afghanistan in which all Afghanis would have a chance to live their lives, and that would not be a home for extremism and terrorism. That's what we fought for. And so this entire idea that we'll just negotiate directly with the Taliban, reach an agreement, and we'll pull out, and you know what, we'll declare victory and retreat, that will leave too many women in Afghanistan behind. And across the globe, we're seeing also a pullback from standing up for women's rights in particular. When we talk about human rights, there are a lot of components to it, but one of the most important components is always going to be women's rights. Because where you see women empowered, where you see women having access to their democratic institutions, having access to the economy, you always see a reduction in extremism, a reduction in violence, and more stable countries.
Moral grounds we have to
Thank you for saying that.
Congressman, can I have a follow-up here?
Well, hold on, I'm going to answer her question. You're right. This is one of the things that I've said is so corrosive to our standing around the globe is when we don't stand up for those values at home. And so allowing, and not only allowing, but separating families, putting children in cages, having policies towards refugees that end the refugee process, not allowing people to apply for the status to be considered to be accepted here, which is a legal form of immigration, to appear at a port of entry and declare. That undermines our ability to lead around the world. But I'll tell you this, even with this president and with this pullback at the presidential level from these values, when the Congress has made statements and cast votes, for example, about not selling arms to Saudi Arabia so they'll be used in Yemen, and other resolutions that we passed, in those countries, that has been picked up by the folks who are struggling to make it. It still is important to hear the voice of the American people and the voice to see that there is, and some powerful institutions on the side of democracy and of human rights. So it's not that it doesn't matter. And of course, I wish that the administration would do things completely differently. And we have done everything we can within the power of just one house of the Congress to try and make sure that happens. But we don't control the whole Congress, and we don't control the presidency. And these things actually are a departure from what we've seen from any other president of any party. This is not a partisan thing. This is a totally new approach to this that I think is inconsistent with our values and inconsistent with our Constitution. So thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm looking at the clock behind us, and I know that we are clocking down. So I'm inviting Pam to come back up. And
Did you have a...
Yes, I have a really serious question which I gave, but I think now clock is running behind, but I want to bring up quick. My main concern, I work a lot for you to bring you in the office. I attended your many town hall meetings. At this point right now, my major concern, because you as a Foreign Affairs Committee member, did you do really step to protect the human rights in 5 major countries?
In what countries?
Major countries, Yemen, Kashmir, Rohingya, Palestine, and one more. There are really violation of human rights.
And so what's your question though?
My question, did you as a member of Foreign Affairs Committee member, did you raise your voice against that? Did you do something practically?
Yeah, well, we've done, I think, as much as, we've had a number of hearings around issues around the globe, and we haven't touched on all of them. But I do think that we have been a voice within our committee for human rights and for pro-democracy around the world. Now, there's always things that I'm sure people would love to see us handle, and we have limited schedules and limited bandwidth for things. But, you know, we've only been in there for, I think, since January 3rd, so we're not all the way through our work, and hopefully that'll continue.
So you will continue, or you believe to protect the human rights?
Of course,
yes,
absolutely.
That's all.
Yeah.
But thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
my
Yeah.
Really.
Again, following about the hot issues, one of the things, like, I really appreciate that you're asking, the White House these questions. But when it comes, like, I'm Egyptian American, when it comes to our President Trump bragging that he supports dictator Sisi of Egypt, and not only that, the Parliament of Egypt bragging that the Sisi following Hitler path, that's in the media. And then our president say, like, oh, he's my favorite dictator. I believe that our foreign policy, including VA, including our spending, we have to say that we are against all dictators, the people who follow the Hitler path.
Yes. No, you're right. So just to, I think in the Washington Post today, there's an article about how our president has conversations with authoritarians that go very well, and has a hard time talking to women leaders and democracies. Yeah, okay. It's not representative of who we are, and it's not reflective of our great country. We've always been a voice for freedom and democracy around the world. We have to be that because, especially now, as I said, so many authoritarians and nationalists are coming to power in different countries around the world, and using that power to roll back democratic gains. We were talking about Turkey or Egypt. I mean, you can kind of go down the list. And that's really a dangerous time for us. It's dangerous for the world. And we need to have leadership that stands up to it. So that's the last thing I'm going to take, as I have to go to my next event. But I appreciate you all for letting me speak with you and for giving me some time. And I thank you so much.